the Twin Towers fell across the road to the 21st century. And the United States had an opportunity to go, left or to go right.
America never really wrestled with what bin Laden said was the motivation for the attack. They were told we were attacked for our freedom. What do we know about the Saudi government's involvement? What can you say to that? Because bin Salman seemingly dismissed the question as if it was a baseless conspiracy.
Well, to put it bluntly, there's just no question whatsoever that bin Laden had, at the very least, financial backing.
Hey Detoxers, welcome to a special episode of the Disinfo Detox. Today we are talking about September 11, 2001 and the legacy it's had in general, but particularly on the generation who lived through it. To help us unpack all of this, I am joined by a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University and the author of a great book, Creating and Failing the 9/11 Generation, The Real Story of September 11. Welcome, Matthew Warshauer, to the Disinfo Detox.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you here. Like I said, it's a great book. Someone who turned 18 right around that time. It really resonated, man. I got to say, and if folks out there around my age, I highly encourage them to read that book, because I think only people my age are still reading books. So let's talk about it, man. When you say the 9/11 generation, what are you talking about?
Oh man, that's the hardest thing to define, right? And in particular, when you're talking about the age, right? When does one generation end? When does another begin? And when you just described that you were 18, I immediately thought, my initial thought right in my head was, all right, so is he on the tail end of the millennials, or is he on the front end of the 9/11 generation? And, this aspect of defining generations is, there's no perfect formula for it. But my essential, idea is that the 9/11 generation was, profoundly impacted by 9/11. Those who were old enough to see it are what I refer to as the direct 9/11 generation. They saw what happened. They witnessed for the first time in their lives true fear. And they saw it among their teachers. They saw it among their parents. I think one of the most commonly shared experiences in the country, and in particular on the East Coast, was kids disappearing from the classroom, parents showing up. Because, what are we going to do? Anybody out there who has kids is going to know when there's a catastrophe, the first thing you think is, oh my God, where are my kids? I need to go make sure my kids are safe. And so parents just flooded into the schools and started grabbing their children and taking them home. And then what did they do? They sat them down on the floor or on the couch in front of a TV with a never-ending loop of that flight slamming into the south side of the South Tower over and over and over again. And these kids had never seen their teachers, never seen their parents like that. So, and then the other side, the indirect 9/11 generation, they're not old enough to remember what happened that day, but they've grown up in the cultural chaos that has never left us, and it's still with us to this day.
And you mentioned in the book, I thought, this is what I meant about things that made me really think about that time period in a way I hadn't thought about it before. You mentioned in the book about how, and I remember being young and hearing this, that, man, you guys, don't watch that. Stop watching that plane hit that building, or stop watching those people fall from that building. That's, you shouldn't be watching that. But to us, it was, I don't want to say it was entertainment, but it was almost just kind of like there. It didn't evoke any, like, I don't know, pain in me as a young person. Now as an older person, I ironically barely watch it. When I see it, it evokes a certain pain. Can you talk about that? And especially in the context, I think you talked about the falling man, I believe is the name that was given. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the falling man's a really powerful symbol. And, and in terms of, before we get into the falling man, I think I need to describe that, in the aftermath of 9/11, you've got a generation of kids who grow up having these moments of silence in school. And they've witnessed all of this stuff on television. They've witnessed the fear in adults around them. But it doesn't mean, as you just literally described, that they were capable of digesting what they had seen. It's just sort of like, what does this mean? But they can sense that fear, and that's not a small thing, right? And the big factor is so few teachers or parents spent time explaining what had happened and what this means. The most that they got was some very bad people did a very bad thing. or terrorists. So, they hate our freedom.
You're hitting on something that's another part of the book here that contributes to this same confusion, which is you talk a lot about how, and this has been a critique that a lot of us critical scholars have pointed out for decades now, that America never really wrestled with what Bin Laden said was the motivation for the attack. They were told we were attacked for our freedom. Can you talk about why you think that is such a lingering problem? Why that's something we should confront, not just as scholars, but as a country and for that generation?
Well, I think, nobody took the time. The parents didn't take the time. The teachers didn't take the time to explain what had happened, right? It was some very bad people did a very bad thing. And we never explored why these attacks happened. George W. Bush focused on the idea that they hate our freedom. I've given so many talks on this subject, and I always ask people, how many of you know who Osama bin Laden was? And everybody in the audience raises their hand. And then I ask, how many of you have ever read anything by Osama bin Laden? And, virtually all the hands go down. And so Americans they're just not aware of what bin Laden said. And to some extent, the reaction to asking that question is, well, why would I read something by him? He's a terrorist and he's evil. And so, reading something that he said would somehow be unpatriotic or give
Mhm.
license to what he said. And, it's just an absurdity. And it's one of the ways that Americans, I think, a lot of the times get duped by propaganda. And, that is so problematic of us not understanding. I always describe it as, if you go back 1,000 years more and go back to what Sun Tzu said in The Art of War, know your enemy, right? You need to know what they're saying. And, when the CIA, the people in the CIA bin Laden unit read the Declaration of Jihad for the first time, they were just blown away by how brilliantly it was argued and how relevant it was. And they got scared in that unit and said, this is a guy who knows how to convince people to do things, right? So, I mean, how bin Laden went about exacting his sense of justice is nothing that we're going to, you know, say was a good thing. But for Americans to understand what his rationale was, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, and this came up again recently. I forget. I mean, in the COVID years, everything kind of blends together. But there was at some point where there was a big freak out in news media that young people were sharing parts of Bin
Yeah.
Laden's take on, I think it was TikTok or something. And you know, to me, I kind of read that moment as young people were kind of realizing the story was much broader. They were starting to realize, like, oh, Bin Laden had this past relationship with the U.S. and foreign policy played a role here, and like it wasn't just he had us for freedom. He had these other like gripes that maybe we can reconsider. So with that kind of in mind, can you, from your best way, can you kind of tell us why did Bin Laden attack us? In his mind, why did he attack us?
Bin Laden attacked us because he didn't want a foreign power, an imperialist foreign power, dictating policy in the Middle East, and in particular Saudi Arabia. Obviously bin Laden was a fundamentalist Muslim. He did not believe that a non-Muslim power should be stationing troops, and this was his big issue, was that American troops were stationed in Saudi Arabia in what he called the land of the two holy places, the two holiest sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina. And that's what his real beef was. I mean, he didn't like U.S. influence in the region, but that was his real problem. When Saddam Hussein and Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the U.S. went into the Middle East, and in particular in Saudi Arabia, they started establishing bases there. And the king of Saudi Arabia had told his people, "Oh, they're only going to be here for a short while." And bin Laden in the Declaration of Jihad specifically says, well, it's not a short while. It's been 7 years. They're still here. And that's one of his big issues. And he had learned from the Afghanistan war in the 1980s that these superpowers will come in and control the economics, control the domestic policy. They'll basically run roughshod and do what they want in your society. And how long have we been studying colonialism and imperialism? as scholars. We know these things are a problem. The United States recognized it after World War One. They recognized it after World War Two. But when you've got oil and capitalism involved in all of this, the powers within our nation, especially in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, where the United States is a unilateral world power, they basically just felt like we could do whatever we wanted, wherever we wanted. And Bin Laden, I think, had not an unreasonable argument.
Okay, let's put this together. So in the book, we've talked about these two things so far. There, is this culture of fear, this anxiety of seeing these images that I don't think, in hindsight, anybody's proud of how much of those images young people saw, whether it be the people jumping to their death or the buildings getting hit or falling. And then there's this, I don't want to call it overly simplified. I think it's just straight up misleading propaganda narrative about how and why 9/11 happened. So in the book, you talk about what are the repercussions of that? Why does that matter? What's the impact it has on the 9/11 generation?
Well, the argument that I make over and over in the book is that the Twin Towers fell across the road to the 21st century. And the United States had an opportunity to go, left or to go right. Uh, and the options were doing what George W. Bush and the neocons did, which is going it completely alone. Basically, the argument, you are with us or you are against us, and we're going to do whatever we have to do. Or embracing a more multilateral approach where we hold a major summit in the world and we work with partners around the world, and there was tremendous opportunity to do this because there was an incredible outpouring of sympathy for the United States. There were countries that had been our traditional enemies: Russia, China, Iran. I mean, Iran of all places reached out to us. They helped us organize a new president for Afghanistan. So there were opportunities, unbelievable opportunities there for a different kind of moving forward. And we made a distinct choice not to follow any of those paths. And the real problem, to get to the heart of your question, is what precedent does the United States set? We defy international law. We thumb our noses at the UN. Well, why? Gee, what has Vladimir Putin done? Right? I mean, this was a game plan that he follows. But even worse is that going into Iraq in particular destabilizes the entirety of the Middle East. And there are, you wouldn't have remembered it because you were 18, right? But there was a petition that went around among American and historians from of other countries, that we all signed these petitions saying, you don't understand. You do not understand cultural studies. You don't know what you're about to do. You're going to blow up the entire Middle East for the next 50 years. And that's exactly what has happened. And so, you have some 35 million people who are displaced in the Middle East. And that in turn impacts directly what has happened in Europe. Brexit and the influx of immigrants. And then you can take it all the way to the extreme of the level of violence that's going on in this country and the fears of what's happening. I mean, when you watch January 6th, and you watched all these guys who had served in the military basically creating military type formations to move forward through the crowds and get to the Capitol building, we trained how many tens and tens and tens of thousands of young men and women how to engage in insurgency. Will that come back to bite us? And where is the level of trust that Americans have in their government? Certainly, many veterans just look at what happened, especially the failure of Afghanistan that looked exactly like Vietnam, and they go, "What the hell did I go over there for?" I mean, right? So all of these are pretty big problems for the present.
Yeah, and I want to throw another one in there. You mentioned this in the book to a degree, but I just want to hear your kind of take on it. Because one of the big personal legacies, at least in my scholarship, is I was enamored by the ways in which news media cheerleaded for the president and lied to the public to get us into Iraq, and that's what launched my interest and eventually career in kind of deconstructing media narratives. And one of the things that became really apparent, particularly in the last 10 or so years, is that a lot of people my age kind of were also enamored and noticing this, albeit, after the case by 2005, 2006, when even the Defense Department was admitting there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And it didn't really work to kind of repairing the industry. I think it really worked to an unhealthy skepticism about news and information. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Oh man, that's so accurate. So when the media supports this, and they also support everything that's going on with Iraq, so they support the idea that there are weapons of mass destruction there. They support the movement into Iraq. I remember Wolf Blitzer, who was a really well-known journalist and well respected, and he had sort of gained his credibility and his chops during the first Gulf War reporting on what was happening. And he made this comment when the statue of Saddam Hussein fell in Iraq. He equated it to like the fall of the wall in East Berlin. Like this is as significant as the fall of the Soviet Union, which was just a complete and total absurdity. And even the story behind the fall of the Saddam statue, which was held up as this amazing, moment, it was all orchestrated. When you dig into the background to that, it was just this fake media produced thing. Same thing with the mission accomplished thing on the USS Abraham Lincoln, where Bush flies in and he gives this speech. He's got the banner, mission accomplished.
Like 3
And
weeks into the war.
yeah,
That went
three
on
weeks
for years
before.
after. Yeah.
And that, by the way, was created by a Hollywood company that helped him with this production, right? So there's so much misinformation that goes on here. And I had argued that, it was the biggest lie of the 21st century, only subsumed by the lie of January 6th, and that Trump was cheated out of the election of 2020. So what does all this do, as your scholarship shows and where your interest lay, is how much have Americans lost connection with and trust in the media, and that is a profoundly disturbing issue because, right, freedom of the press. And I'm working on an essay right now on the death of the American experiment, question mark, and I'm tracking the experiment and what the founders and others had said about it throughout our history. And where are we today? We are seeing the most profound threat to the American experiment that we've experienced since the Civil War. And I think a lot of it is wrapped up in these problems that developed in the post 9/11, in this last 25 years, the first quarter of the 21st century. I think they're intimately connected.
Yeah, and this is just I love when a life kind of lines up this way. So a couple weeks ago, I was reading your book, and shortly thereafter, the Saudi crown prince Mohammed bin Salman ends up in the White House, and wouldn't you know it, one of the ABC reporters, and we criticize reporters a lot here, so we'll give. Her last name's Bruce. Credit for asking this question. Asked the Saudi prince about the nation's involvement in 9/11. This has always been, for whatever reason, a really big third rail in American media. The 28 pages supposedly in the federal government's report on 9/11 blocked out the mention of Saudi Arabia. I believe all or most of those were declassified around like 2021, 22, somewhere
Yeah,
in there.
Joe Biden released them. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay, so tell us, what can we say about what we know about the Saudi government's involvement? We know 15 of the hijackers were Saudi nationals, I believe. What do we know
Yeah.
about the Saudi government's involvement? What can you say to that? Because bin Salman seemingly dismissed the question as if it was a baseless conspiracy.
Well, to put it bluntly, there's just no question whatsoever that bin Laden had, at the very least, financial backing from those inside the kingdom, in some of the very elevated circles of the government. Uh, at worst, he had some help getting the actual visas. Now we don't know the specifics of this. One of the things that when Bush blacked out those many pages, Um, that was a big issue and it put up a lot of red flags. We also know in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 that there's a bunch of members of the bin Laden family who were very, very quickly flown out of the United States on private jets when all of American airspace had been closed down. So, yet again, another connection between the Bush administration and the Saudis. But the really big thing is that towards the end of Barack Obama's presidency, there was a bill that was pushed through actually over his veto called the JASTA Act, Justice Against State-Sponsored Terrorism Act, which allowed American citizens to sue the Saudi government for their involvement. And that lawsuit is still going right now. It's pending. The attorneys are collecting information and they're doing Freedom of Information Act inquiries to try and get to the bottom of it. How much did the United States government know about all of this? But there's just, bin Laden was heavily, heavily connected through the Saudi government because his father was heavily connected through the Saudi government. I mean, when you go in and you study the background of Mohammed bin Laden's connection to the royal family, it's as deep as you can possibly get. And during the 1980s, when bin Laden was fighting in Afghanistan, that operation, for every dollar that the United States put into the fight against the Russians, the Saudi government matched it dollar for dollar. So there is an incredible trail of connection between bin Laden and radicals within the Saudi government.